Hi everyone, I'm Felix, founder and CEO at ADPList. And we're on a mission to help every person grow their human potential by bringing shared knowledge and inspiration to the world. Today, I have a really special guest, Ethan Evans. He's a coach and retired VP from Amazon. In Ethan's 15 plus years at Amazon, he has led global teams of over 800 people and invented well known businesses and products such as Prime Video, Amazon App Store, and many more, including Prime Gaming and Twitch Commerce. Ethan hosts over 70 plus patents. I hold none. And he has reviewed over 10,000 resumes and conducted over 2,500 interviews and made 1,000 over hires in his career. He was an Amazon bar raiser, which is a very interesting process. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And a bar raiser core leader responsible for training and maintaining Amazon's group of interview outcome facilitators. He has spent some time coaching folks from companies all the way from big tech companies to startups, executives as well, into leaders. And so today we're super excited to have Ethan Evans with us. Ethan, welcome to today's ADPList interview.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and I'm excited to be here. I love to share what I've learned as a way of helping others find success and satisfaction in their careers.
Thank you so much. And that's actually one of the email titles that we sent out was stuck in your career and question mark. And so a lot of people opened that, and I knew immediately that you would be such a great speaker for us. And thank you so much for coming on. Ethan, I want to start off today's conversation by really just, diving into a little bit of your own personal story and your life, just to know you as a human being before we get into, the technicalities of today's conversation. From our, from what we have read, you grew up in a farm in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a pretty interesting upbringing or a pretty interesting, childhood in that sense, which many in my generation would not have grew up, in places like that. So can you describe a little bit about the environment in which you grew up in and how that early experience helped shape your work ethic and your worldview today?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. So I did grow up in small town Ohio. You have a global audience, so Ohio is a rural, sort of farming and industrial part of America. I grew up outside the city of Cincinnati, but it was an hour away, and we didn't go there very often. It was a big deal to go there. And let's see, I grew up on a farm of 75 acres, so like maybe 30 hectares. And even though I had siblings, I was the youngest child by a large gap. So I was effectively an only child with somewhat older parents. The things that might resemble the things that are the same as maybe many listeners, my parents were very well educated. My father had a PhD in chemistry, and farming was like his second job. He worked full time as a researcher, but he worked full time in a place that was a 40-hour job because that was much more normal then. He didn't bring much work home with him. My mother had a master's degree in chemistry, but ended up just being a stay at home mom for much of my life. So I grew up, though, around highly educated parents who venerated education. That's going to be something many people recognize. And work was just expected. I think one way that shaped my work ethic, it's common now for people to take, say, 5 years to complete college or to have a gap year between high school and college. I can honestly say I never thought of that as even an option. Like, it never occurred to me that you could take more than 4 years to go to college, or that I wasn't going to college. It was just assumed. And then as soon as I graduated from college and then from my master's program, I had jobs immediately. And, I had been out of college like a week or two when my dad said, okay, you need to get your own car insurance. So it was very quickly like, here you go. You have a job now. You're done with college. Go. And I think that, well, I feel like I outworked many of my smarter peers. So I do feel that I know a lot of people who I would say would do better on an IQ test or an SAT than I would. But I ended up having more success, and I think it was focus on work.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Ethan. And before we jump into, a little bit more about sort of executives, in which is
Mm-hmm.
the next topic, but I really want to touch on that. We should talk a little bit about an interesting point is that your hard work seems to be able to help you succeed in your career and things that you do more than folks that might have a higher IQ. What can our generation learn from yours? From that environment, from that time when you grow up, and what because a lot of folks, I think maybe in our generation, we grew up in a place where we have iPhones and we have desktops and everything. Are there valuable things that we can take away from your generation and your growing up?
Well, I hope so. It's yes, it is interesting. I sometimes have to remember that there's a generation gap between us. Um, I got one of the first computers to exist, an Apple II, which by modern standards did nothing in 1984. And so I learned to program while still in high school, self-taught. But and then that's what led me to want to be in computer science.
Yep.
So I think the lesson I don't want people to take away is, oh, you must slave away and work your whole life all the time. That can be your only focus. I'm a big fan of a book you may know, and if you don't, it'll be fun to share. It's called The Almanac of Naval Ravikant.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
Naval is a venture capitalist, an angel investor in Silicon Valley, but he does a really good job explaining a concept I believe in, which is if you can find work that you like, then being dedicated or focused on your work isn't a penalty. It's fun. So, for
Yeah.
example, showing up here today and talking to you, I love helping people with their careers. And so it's not work for me. It's not work for me to be here. Now, yes, it takes my time and you have to balance that with other things you want to do, but I will leave our conversation more energized for the day than if I hadn't had it. And so I think what people can take away is if you want to succeed in your career, you have to seek that alignment where you enjoy doing what you do. Not all the time. We all have to do some unpleasant tasks.
Yeah.
My next task is to call a medical provider about a bill confusion. I can tell you it's not something I want to do or something that will energize me, but it's something I will
Yeah.
need to do. And so you have to
Yeah.
balance those things. But if much of your work is stuff you enjoy, then you could work very hard without feeling penalized by that. And I think that's the secret that your
Wow.
generation can take away is finding that alignment.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And by the way, I'm 27 right now, and so there is a generation gap. And I've always been so curious, like, what is it like living in the time where PCs were new and whatnot? So thank you for bringing that perspective. And so let's dive a little bit into your masterwork and what you're really good at, which is helping leaders turn themselves and grow into true executives.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all over your website, your social media, in which your goal is to really help leaders grow into true execs.
Mm-hmm.
And the question that I have to really kickstart this topic is, what is executives? Who are executives? What is the definition of executives?
Yeah. So, of course, it is a fuzzy definition. And if you ask enough people, you'll get different definitions. But for me, there's a couple key factors. The first is more a focus on strategy and direction than on execution. Executives absolutely lead execution, but they are very much in the space of figuring out what needs to be done and what the priorities are, not just organizing the work to get it done. It's often summarized as managers work in the system and leaders, another word that can be used in an executive context, work on the system. So the leader is figuring out what is it we're trying to do and what is the structure that will deliver that. And the manager is saying, okay, here's the structure and the goals. How do I get everybody in place and all the pieces in place and unblocked to make that happen? So, in any case, executives are normally leading very large teams, and they're normally either completely setting the strategy or very much a big part of choosing the strategy and deciding on what it is that's going to get done.
Thanks for sharing that. It's so clear about the way that you define. A lot of it is got to do with strategy, and there's a lot of misconception as well with the word executives versus management.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is the misconception? What is the difference here between executives and management?
Yeah, well, you're right. There's confusion, and that's because often the words get used as synonyms. Who's our leader, our boss, our manager, our executive? And of course, at some level, the executive is a manager. So, how is that true and how is that false? As a manager, if we just look at management usually means the personnel administrative duties. So, the hiring, the firing, the performance reviews, the time scheduling, the feedback, it's the mechanics, the mechanical skills of administrating a group of people. So if you want words that are further apart, management has these two pieces: administration and then leadership. And the leadership is more the executive piece, and the administration is more the daily nuts and bolts of what gets called management. So there is no bright and shining line, because managers lead and executives manage or execute. So you do have to cross over. This is not particularly different. You've shared with me, obviously, a lot of your audience is in the design field. Designers,
Yeah.
even though they may have specialties, visual designers often think about UX, and UX designers often produce some visual design. So there isn't this perfectly bright line that says, oh, well, UX designer will never, create a button, or
Right.
like that isn't going to happen. So,
Wow.
um, I think the big difference, though, is that managers are judged mainly on their ability to get a medium to even large size set of tasks done. So they're very much about, are they able to organize and motivate a team of people to get something figured out and finished? The piece that is different for executives, again, is trying to make the key choices of what should be done. Because I've built
Yeah.
products that worked and nobody wanted them. And I've also struggled to build products and a failure of execution. And finally, when everything works right, I've led the creation of products that people loved, that they used to an unexpected or surprise degree. And that's, of course, what you're looking for. You're looking for that magic in a bottle where people rush to you. And so, for example, you mentioned that I specialize now in getting people unstuck in their careers. When I first proposed to do a class about being stuck in senior management or middle management and getting to executive, I was shocked by how much demand it got. So here I was, sort of thinking that maybe some people needed this, but when I opened the door, many more people responded than I expected. And that's what
Wow.
you're looking for.
Wow. That is definitely a huge demand there, because, and you're 100% right, Ethan. There's just a lot of misconceptions around management and executives, what they mean, what they do. And I think because of that sort of that misalignment and misdefinition of things, people get confused as to where do they go, how do they navigate that situation. Which brings me to the next question. And as you have seen a lot of managers trying to be executives, what are some of the very common mistakes that you see managers make while trying to transit into the next level of executive?
Um, so great question. Uh, the title of a very good book in this space answers that in part. It's Malcolm Gladwell, his book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. Um, and that book, that title, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, specifically goes to the point up through being a manager. Your priorities are your personal expertise and your ability to get things done, to execute, to deliver, to build, to organize a small team or even a medium-sized team to create something. But those skills won't get you to the executive level. And the problem is people like to lean on their strengths. And so since those skills have allowed them to go from, say, entry level to senior to principal to manager, they're like, hey, this works. I just need to keep getting better at what I'm doing. That doesn't translate. So you have to change what you're doing. You have to stop focusing so much. That's one piece. The second related piece is often people who spent a long time improving their own personal skills then get frustrated that the choice of who makes an executive is not only based on your professional skill. It's so being the best engineer, being the best designer, being the best lawyer does not make you an executive. But a lot of people get frustrated. They say, oh, well, for example, in the executive world, your ability to relate with and influence other executives is incredibly important. But a lot of people say, well, that's political. That just means you need to be good at politics. And I don't think that's fair. Yes, sometimes there are politics, but I almost feel, I often say, politics are what you label the situation where another influential person won the influence battle over you. Like, we call that and say, oh, they're political because we don't want to say, I just got beaten. I wasn't articulate. I wasn't good at influencing. Now there are real politics. So anyway, summarizing, people get stuck in two places. They don't change. They keep trying to do the same things they've been doing, only harder with more force. And that isn't enough. And second, some people do get hung up on, oh, well, being an executive is not really about being good. It's about being political. And that's not true, although I understand where people get that impression.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Ethan. And it seems a lot that, you know, it almost seems counterintuitive where you shouldn't be doing things you're good at. You should be diving into new frontiers when you make that transition into executives. And it's almost going to feel uncomfortable. I can
For
imagine that
sure.
from my personal experience. How do you think people should ease into that discomfort?
Well,
Are there any tips, advice around that? Yeah.
absolutely. The first tip or advice is cognitive, which is, do you understand that, you obviously have articulated, but do you understand that you're changing careers? There's a career change from being an individual contributor to being a manager. And it's a new skill set. You're trained as a designer or an engineer or a doctor or a marketer. You went to school for it. You have a master's degree maybe in this field, but now you're leaving that field behind. And unless you've been in the military or maybe done an MBA, you don't have a management degree, but you're taking on how to manage. And then there's a second transition. Once you're a manager, you're kind of leaving that career partially behind to become an executive. And so you have to be aware of that. The second thing I then coach people is why? Why are you pursuing that? Yes, everybody loves money, and that's okay. And these positions pay more. But I just want the money usually won't motivate you to be a good manager. Um, an interesting story. I was considering early in my career getting a PhD and becoming a professor. And there were very few teaching assistantships available where I was doing my master's program. And I wrote this short, they had an application where I could write down, why did I want a teaching assistantship? And I wrote, well, I'm considering being a professor, and I've had many bad professors. So I'd like to try it before I do it. And out of all these sort of starving graduate students who wanted this job because it would give them free tuition, I was chosen. And I think, although no one ever told me, I think it's because I had said, let me try this before I wrote some snarky line like, let me try this before we inflict another bad professor on the world. Um, and that was very arrogant because here I'm writing a bunch of administrators in a university
Yeah.
and saying there are a lot of bad professors. They're probably like, wow, this kid's arrogant. And they would have been right. Um,
Yeah.
but I think this same thing applies in the executive world, which is you're taking on a new skill. Being a professor of engineering, which I never did, um, but could have, I guess, is very different from being an engineer. And I understood even at that relatively early age that I was changing skill sets from engineer to teacher. Um, I think so. First, recognize their change. Then, how do you ease into it? I love to advise people study what you see, meaning when you interact with your executives or you see them in meetings, don't just listen to what they're saying. Listen with ears and watch with eyes that are studying what are they trying to accomplish. Yes, they're saying words in this all hands meeting or this review meeting, but what's their goal? What are they aiming towards? And then how effective are they being at doing that? Are they doing it in a way I would copy or I could copy? Are they doing it in a way I hate? So, example, some executives shout and pound the table. Maybe you don't want to
Yeah.
be that kind of leader, but you can still ask yourself, this person who shouts and pounds the table, are they getting the results they want? Are they not? What result are they trying to get? And so I think an easy way to think about this that should resonate with the people listening, you can go to an art gallery and you can either look at the art and say, wow, I like this painting. Or you can look at it and say, how is this painting constructed? What was the artist trying to do? What medium did they use? Did they choose the right medium? Would I have chosen it differently if I were trying to express the same idea? Would I have done it differently? How would I have done it differently? And if going to a museum and looking at art isn't the right analogy, just think about this with films. You can watch a movie or you can view a film. Watching a movie means I turn my brain off. I enjoy, Marvel heroes bashing space monsters. Um,
Yeah.
Viewing a film is, of course, what's the cinematography? What's the focus depth? What's the camera angle? How are the actors being directed? It's just a very different. And a way to ease in is study your executives and see their skills or their
Thanks for
gap.
sharing that. It sounds like a lot of it is, as you mentioned, in two steps, which is, two parts, in which the first one is the cognitive, and really just acknowledging that it's a totally different job. You're going to have to learn, you're going to have to grow into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is to observe and see for yourself, and to see what you might want to learn, what you love and what you don't, and what you want to sort of take in, and what you don't want to take in, which is interesting. Brings me on to the next question. I'll throw a little bit of span onto that, which is, not everyone would have the privilege of being in a room where there are good executives to learn from. And I think this is something that might be true in many different companies, or even just managers. Like, you don't have good managers everywhere. So if they don't have that, what would you advise? Would you still advise just looking at that, or searching outwards?
Well, of course, it's always good. Anytime you have the chance to upgrade the people you're around, you should, within
Yeah.
reason, right? If you have a chance to move to where you have stronger peers, stronger leaders, that will almost that's almost always going to benefit you. Because think about the reverse. When would you ever want to say, well, I want to go work around weaker people? I guess that would be
Yeah.
good if you wanted to shine by comparison, but otherwise, it's going to be very
Yeah.
unsatisfying. That said, when you're working, one of my critical lessons was learning to see value in leaders that I didn't like or that I thought were doing wrong things. A couple times in my career, I harshly criticized leaders that I thought were making mistakes, that their end conclusions were wrong, or that their methods were wrong. But what I learned is I had to ask myself, in those cases, the leaders above me, so usually the CEO of a startup, would end up telling me, you have some points, Ethan, but this other person is still valuable. And they would either tell me that in words or they would tell me in actions, because I'd be like, we should fire them. They suck. And they'd be like, yeah, please go back to engineering. And I'd be like, but they suck. And they'd be like, okay, no, really, enough, go. I'm like, I'm being shut down here. Why? So I would study it and I would realize they were bringing a skill or a value to that leader that I wasn't recognizing. In one case, it was sales. There was a salesperson who I didn't believe in what they were doing or how they were doing it. But in the end, they were bringing in money to a startup that needed money. And so the message was, we don't actually care about this person's other skills. We care that we need cash to pay people and they're bringing it in. And I wasn't seeing that, like, in the end, because that was paying my own salary and other people's salary, even if they were doing some things I didn't agree with, it was important and valuable. So the point here, I could give other examples, but the point is, when you see a leader that you don't think is very good, or you have a leader who has weaknesses, study and learn their weaknesses and think about how you would do better. But also look and ask, why is this person still here then? Why are they being valued? Why do they, if they have all these flaws, why does the CEO or whoever's above them still value them? So in another case, I had a leader, his key skill, you may not even consider it a skill, but it was extreme loyalty. No matter what the manager above him asked for, he would do everything he could to make that true. And so the leader above him valued, if I ask, I'm going to get. They didn't have to worry about, does this leader have a different opinion, or are they going to go slowly on something I want? They knew that if they asked this person to jump, he was going to get his whole team airborne and then ask how hot.
Wow.
And I was on that team and I hated this because the leader would say jump and my boss would be like, get in the air. And I'd be like, wait, I don't understand. I don't agree. And he'd be like, you're not in the air. You're failing. I was like, holy shit. But I had to adjust my thinking to say, okay, why is this behavior being valued? And the leader in that case, candidly, wanted our team to move faster. And he was okay with the idea that we might go in the wrong direction or not do everything the smartest. He wanted to see more activity. And so he was okay with it. And I did leave that team. I was incompatible with it. But, you know, as you said, I had the privilege to do that, right? I had the opportunity.
So a lot of it, as you say, is it really comes down to the fact where, you know, if you don't have sort of quote unquote good managers or good executives, there are still some things where you can learn from them. There are still some things where you can see what you know would do differently, or you know, or in your case, in the sense, like, try to understand why are they even there.
Mm-hmm.
If they're really doing such a bad job, why are they even there in the first place? And try to see how that fits into the bigger picture and how you might also fit into the bigger picture. And in your case, if it doesn't fit what you're doing and where you're going, then you can, if you have the opportunity, you can simply leave and find something else, which is, I think, yeah.
It's often worth starting with the humble perspective of, if I think my manager is bad, but they've been put in management, what am I missing? What am I not seeing of where they are valued or successful? It
Wow.
may still be because we all have weaknesses. I have weaknesses, you have weaknesses. It may still be they have a number of weaknesses that are hurting you. And it may be that those weaknesses are good reasons to leave if you can. But they got there somehow. And learning to see that somehow, with this manager I had that I've discussed, he wanted us to get airborne, he wanted us to move fast.
Yep.
I quickly learned, as long as I worked there, okay, the way to make this guy happy is show a lot of enthusiasm for the latest priority. And so I can do
Wow.
that, right? This isn't like a hard change. It's a change I
Yep.
didn't always agree with, but it wasn't hard to do. And so while I was there, I could make myself successful in his eyes again by being all in and gung ho.
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, I could think like, is this the right environment for me? And that's okay.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. It's there's so much, as you say, it's like going in with a sort of like a humility and a sense of open mind, and to question it, but also to, have a curiosity around, what's going on. And thanks for sharing that. Now I want to move on to the next conversation, which is about one of, I would say, one of the more viral guest posts that you have done, and it's with Lenny's newsletter,
Mhm.
and that is the what you call the magic loop.
Yes.
And I don't know if a lot of people here have read it. I myself have read it. I'm a subscriber of the newsletter, and I just found it simply amazing. I saw so many good reviews around it. People are talking about it. At least the ones who are subscribed to it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you, for those who have not seen it, have not read it, what is the magic loop?
Yeah. So the magic loop is my formula for career success, both that I used myself and that I teach others. And it has 5 simple steps. And those steps are: first, you have to be doing whatever job you have well. You don't have to be the best, but your manager can't see big shortfalls in you. And the reason that step matters is step 2 depends on it, which I'll get to in a second. But for step 1, do your job well. And the way you find this out is you basically go, you either have an annual review, and if your review is pretty good, you're done, or you go talk to your manager and say, look, I want to make sure I'm doing my job well. Am I basically doing a good job, or are there critical things I need to fix? If there are things you need to fix, then you fix them. Or if you cannot, then you find a role where you're a better match. Step 2 is the critical step, which is you then go to your manager and say, look, how can I help you? And why this step is so critical. First, people help those who help them. We're much more motivated to help people who help us. Second, managers always desperately need help. And surprisingly, I've interviewed thousands now of managers by having them raise their hands in big discussions. Very few managers get this offer. It might surprise you, but very few people go into their manager's office and say, hey, I've caught up on my work. What could I do that you're worried about? What would really help you? What do you need from me? And just doing that sets you apart. So step 3 is super simple. Whatever they ask you to do it. And of course, sometimes we all dream that they'll ask us to take on this wonderful, challenging, beautiful project that we were hoping for anyway, but often they ask us to do something less enjoyable. But that's what they need help with. And a story I often tell here is, consider if there's someone you don't like. You don't have to hate them, but just someone you don't care for, and you're like in a meeting with them, and their pencil falls off the table and rolls under your chair, and they're like, hey, could you grab my pencil? Well, honestly, if you don't like them, there's part of you is like, nah, crawl under the table and get it yourself, right? Now, because we don't want to be viewed as jerks, we'll probably pick it up, but there's this fleeting thought of like, eh. Now, compare that to your friend who calls you on Friday afternoon and says, I know you have plans for this weekend, but I'm caught in a pinch and I need to move my apartment. And I know it's going to rain, but could you come help me pack up and carry boxes to the truck in the rain and then unpack. Well, this is like such a bigger ask than pick up my pencil. But since it's a
Yeah.
friend of yours, what do you think? You think, well, I do need to help Ethan out. I do need to help Felix out. Like, what can I do? Can we make 2 hours? How? So the way you grow in your career is to build this relationship with your manager. And that begins with you helping them. That begins with you contributing to them. Now, so step 1, do your job well. Step 2, ask how you can help. Step 3, do it. Step 4 is the other critical piece. It's where you go back to your manager and say, I'm really enjoying helping you. I've done this, I've done that. I would like to become whatever, a senior designer, a manager, an executive. I'd like to change my career to this other type of role. I'd like to become a product manager. Is there something I can help you with that would also put me on that path? Is there something you need? And most good managers, even medium good managers, will say, sure, we'll find something for you. And by the way, because you're helping them and others aren't, you can talk to them and say, I really want to do this, but I'm like really busy with this other work. Is there anyone else who could do that? And they'll be like, yeah, we'll give this to this person who's not helping. We'll just push it on them. Don't ever mistake how much favoritism managers will show, just like you're showing favoritism to the friend of yours as opposed to the person who dropped the pencil. Because if you think of my story, if the person that you didn't like called you up and said, would you help me move my apartment? You'd be like, I'm sorry, I'm busy. Right? Like,
Yeah.
even by the way, if you weren't, you'd be like, I'm not doing that. So
Yeah.
we think favoritism is a bad word. And at some level it is, but it's also human nature. We all play favorites. We all have favorites. We have people we like and people we don't. Become someone your manager likes. Now, some people will say, oh, well, that's brown nosing. That's kissing up. No,
Yeah.
that's understanding that helping out is part of being helped out. And if you just want to bang the table and say managers should, I coach a lot. Anytime you begin a career frustration with managers should or executives should or HR should, you're giving up your power. You're pushing it onto what you hope the other person would do. And you may be right, by the way. Managers should invest in your career. They should mentor you. But managers have their own life and their own career, and they're actually spending most of their time thinking about how they move up, not about how you move up. So if you want that investment, you have to earn it. And you earn it by forming a collaboration where you help them and then they help you. So the final step in the loop is the easiest of all. It just says repeat. Keep going around this cycle. And I've seen both personally and with many others unbelievable results. So
Wow. What that is so, when I first read this framework and now just hearing it in person, it kind of amplifies the clarity, but it just feels so simple, so grounded, so much clarity in that. But it doesn't seem like a lot of people are doing it. And you're 100% right, Ethan, when you say that almost 90% or even more people don't go into the room and ask the manager, what can I do to make your job easier? How can I help you with your job? And so I'm curious, after you sort of teach this framework and coach this framework to your clients and to people as well, what are some of the most remarkable stories that you can share that really transform someone's career, if there's any that you fondly remember?
Oh, I think my favorite story here is of someone who wrote me back and said, how do I stop the magic loop? How do I?
Wow.
He said, I've had so much. I think he said it had been 11 months. And he said, I've built such a strong relationship with my leaders. They've given me a new job. They've uh, given me new responsibilities, and it's coming too fast. Now I'm feeling over my head. I'm feeling beyond my skills. I'm excited, but I'm worried I'm going to start failing, because once I stepped up and made myself available and offered to grow and expressed an interest, they're giving me so much. And I've had this experience myself too, where I've had to go to a manager, in this case, my vice president, when I was a director at Amazon. I had become valuable enough to him that kind of anytime he had a problem, he gave it to me. Not anytime, that's too strong, but many
Yeah.
times. He would hand me and say, do you want to do this? Can you do that? And at one point, my team had grown at that point from maybe 30 people when I began working with them to 200. And those 200 were spread across many different disciplines. And I had to say, like, whoa, his name was Paul. I remember going to him and say, Paul, I love that you're giving me more. I love it. But we need to take a short pause while I figure out how to do this job, because I'm feeling very over my head. And he was, of course, supportive of that. Well, I say, of course, managers don't want to give work to people that might cause them to fail. That isn't in their best interest, right? You can often just think about what's in people's selfish best interest. A manager giving you things that gets it off their plate, if you want it and you can take it, is great. It's in their self-interest. I do less, you do more, you feel challenged, engaged, and happy. I can go do something else, win-win. But if I give you something and you're going to F it up because you're over your head, now I don't actually have it done. Instead, I have a mess. That's like lose-lose. You're unhappy because you failed. I'm unhappy because you failed. So you can have that conversation. So that's probably my favorite example, is people coming back to me and saying, this works so well, I need to put the brakes on it. How do I do that?
Wow. I would never have imagined this would be your favorite story, because I would just imagine that 90% of people who hear the magic loop would be like, I'm going to start doing it tomorrow. And there's no point where in their head they want to stop it. And in this case, it sounds so interesting that, there are people out there who wants to some sort of slow down on that.
They need to pause, right? I think everybody, once people are addicted to this idea, they usually keep using it, but they have to get they have to find out how to pace it, because if you're in a high growth environment, or you have a really good manager who has a lot to do, there is the problem of, a common problem people ask me about is, if I ask my manager what else I can do, won't they just give me work till I'm overworked? And so part of pacing it is going back to the manager and saying, I'm doing this thing that you asked for and I love it, but I'm finding I have too much to do now. Can we spend a little bit of time and look at everything I'm doing, and what can I eliminate, or what can we give to someone else?
Right.
And what you try to do, it's a fun game, and usually your manager will play along because they like you and you're stepping up to new higher value tasks. That's the key, is you can give away the tasks you don't like. Remember, I talked earlier about Naval Ravikant being aligned to work you like.
Yeah.
I had the luxury in high growth environments of give away the work I don't like and keep the work I'm really gifted at. And then I'm able to, but you have to be delivering enough value. And of course, sometimes you have to keep, I did run into cases where I had to keep the ugly work I didn't like because it was very important. It didn't maybe match me or thrill me, but sometimes unpleasant work is also critical work.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Ethan. And there's so much to learn from that. I want to ask you the last few questions, and then obviously sort of like move on to really interesting stories that you have shared on the internet. So, talking about sort of this magic loop, there are a lot of things that causes someone's career to plateau, to be stuck, and that's really, I think, a big topic for today, which is how do you get unstuck. But the thing is that, what are some of the very common things that you see plateauing someone's career and people don't even notice it?
Well, we talked about the need to recognize what skills the next level needs that are different. That's one. We talked about attitude, that role requires things that I don't want to do. or that I don't believe in. Those are two common stuck points. But if we look further, I would say other things that get people stuck, not actively stepping up, or related to that, feeling that someone else needs to do something. I often give a short phrase. People would come to me and say, why aren't you doing more for my career? Or, the question would be, who owns your career? And the answer is, well, you do, because if I owned your career, it would be called my career. And I already have one. Like, I own my career and I'm busy working on my career. Yes, as a leader, I have a responsibility to help you with yours, but my role is the helper. Your role is the owner. And I think some people get stuck because at more entry level, early in your career, other people do that work for you. A manager has 10 years of experience, 15 years of experience. You're fresh out of college. They put you on tasks that help you develop. They acknowledge, okay, you've moved from junior to regular designer or whatever. They kind of do the work of trying to move you along. But once you get to the leadership level, other leaders expect that you know how to manage your career. And they view their only role is when you bring me a plan, I should be able to discuss it with you. And my job is to maybe open some of the doors for you, but 90% of it's on you coming up with what you want to do and showing you can do it. Like, we have very little to do.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
that's where people get stuck, is they're stuck in the old model. I often call it, I say hope is not a strategy. Many people, their career strategy is a literal quote: work hard and hope to be noticed. And this is a terrible career strategy. I would particularly say women fall into this. It's not always, but many women, when I talk to them and I say,
Yeah.
I think you're working hard and hoping to be noticed, they say, God, you're right. I thought that was what I should do. It's not only women, but you have to be taking a more active role. I've said a lot of words. The last phrase I'll give is, working hard is not enough. We've been taught all our lives. See, university teaches us that hard work is all that matters because there's an objective test and you get high marks and that results in a good grade. But work is more complicated than that in a corporate career, and there's more to it than just how hard do you work. How good is your letter grade?
Wow.
There's a lot more to it.
Thank you so much for that, Ethan. It's something that some of us, we learn through the hard lessons, myself included, that hard work is never really the only thing that makes you successful. So thanks for sharing that. And I want to move on to the next thing, which is a lot about, I think you have the famous story of failing Jeff Bezos.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us might have heard it, some of us might have not. If you could sort of summarize about this story where you famously failed Jeff Bezos,
Mm-hmm.
And what is that you failed, and what did you take away from that whole saga?
Yeah. So a quick version of the story is, I was a director responsible for launching a new product, and it was a product he really cared about. And we built the product. We got ready to deploy it. We worked all night to deploy it, and some things weren't working. Jeff woke up in the morning and asked, "Why isn't it working?" Or he asked, "Where is it?" And I told him, I sent him an email that said, "Well, there's some problems. We're working on them." And the first lesson is, all of us are usually optimists. We think we're 5 minutes from solving it, or 30 minutes. So I was thinking to myself, like, have breakfast, get in the shower, get on the treadmill, anything, give me 30 minutes. And more like 30 seconds later, I had a reply back that said, "What problems?" And then he started digging in, and I was sunk. So thing one is,
Wow.
be careful of your optimism. You're never as close to a solution as you think. Second, though, the big lesson was, how did I recover from that? Both short term and long term. So uh, it turns out we had made some pretty basic coding errors and also design errors in the rush to get this project done. They were innocent, but they were severe. So what I had to do was both manage the immediate crisis, which is take responsibility. And there were layers of management between me and Jeff Bezos, but I made clear I owned it. So this is my project, here's what we're doing. And then the way I earned credibility, and I've learned this system, is I would email him, let's say now it's 8 a.m. I would email him an email copied to all the other people he was copying that said, this is where we are, this is what we know, this is what we've done in the last hour, this is our plan for the next hour, you will get another update at 9 a.m. And what I was doing was buying credibility 55 minutes at a time. The idea being he was making a decision. Can Ethan handle this problem, or do I need to see someone else? Do I need to send in someone else to handle it? By giving him clear 1 hour plans, he only had to trust me 1 hour at a time. Kind of subconsciously, he can think, or any leader can think, okay, Felix has made a mistake, or Felix is managing a crisis, but his plan for the next hour is good, so I can decide an hour from now if he's on track. And then I did this every hour. And because I was showing intelligent plans and good progress, he never yanked me out and said, took some other expert and said,
Wow.
have this guy fix it. So that was step one to re-earning credibility. It's clear communication and rapid action. And of course, the other thing I didn't do was point fingers, right? I didn't make any attempt to say, well, this is this or this is that, or I didn't also attempt, like any launch, 90% of our features were working, but one key feature wasn't. I could have said well, the main part of our initiative is working. We'll worry about this as we have time or something. It was clear he thought it was an emergency, so I needed to treat it that way. The second part of recovering credibility was after this crisis ended, I had a meeting scheduled with Jeff. I was invited to a meeting where he was going to be present. And my first thought was, wow, this guy's mad at me and I just screwed up. Maybe I should skip the meeting. I wasn't strictly required, but I decided as soon as I had that thought, I thought, if I can't face the CEO, I better just pack my desk. So instead, what I did is I went to the meeting, and Jeff always sits in the same seat in his conference room. So I knew where he'd be sitting, and I took the seat right next to it. And I said, okay, if I'm going to let's find out where I stand with this guy. Let's unmistakably plant myself next to him. And he came into the room, and we had the meeting. And actually, I was sweating bullets through all of it because it seemed like he was ignoring me, maybe a little pointedly. But at the same time, now when I reflect on it, I realize, as I said, I was kind of not the main person in the meeting. I was optional. At the end of the meeting, he turned to me and said, so how are you doing? I bet it's been a tough week. And the fact that he could have said all sorts of things to me, like, why are you here when your team is a mess? Or he even could have said, what's the status of your problem software? But instead, he reached out to me as a person. So first, that was really good leadership on his part. Because if he'd said either of the other things, which by the way, were totally justifiable, I probably would have left. Not just the meeting, but the company.
Wow.
Well, because what do you do when the CEO is like, what are you doing here? You'd be like, okay, I'm screwed. Second, I was able to then have a little bit of a conversation with him and realize, yes, he had been mad, but he was over it. He was didn't mean that he trusted me again, but it meant he was willing to give me a chance. So the final thing I had to do, to summarize the end of the story, is then I had to re-earn trust over the long term. Okay, the guy didn't hate me. He didn't want me to leave. But it didn't change the fact that I had messed something up that was preventable. So I had to show to him and other leaders, that was a one-off. That everyone makes mistakes. That was my mistake, but I learned from it. And now here's 2 years of evidence that I don't do that often. And I was eventually promoted. So I was promoted from director to vice president even after having sort of failed this launch. So that's the whole story in a nutshell.
Wow, thanks so much for that, Ethan. And I think a lot of people would be so curious how you regain that trust, because it's supposedly it's a big launch, as what you have
Mm-hmm.
said, and there's a lot of things going on. How did you regain that trust? Did it take long? Was it overnight
It
that you
no,
had
it took
regained
2 years. It
Wow.
well, I was basically up for promotion to VP when I screwed this up, and my actual promotion then occurred 2 years later. So
Wow.
that was a big cost to pay, but I also had a big mistake.
Right.
The way you so trust is a really interesting word. It's difficult to actually define. We all know what we mean when we say I trust you, but why do I trust you? The usual best operative answer is trust is consistency over time. It's doing, it's saying what you're going to do and then actually following through and doing it consistently. Because if you interview me and it's a good experience, and then you interview me again and it's a good experience, and you do it for someone else and they say it's a good experience, then I can learn from that. Oh, Felix, he's a good interviewer, but it's consistency over time. I can then trust in it. So what I had to do was put in the time to consistently deliver good results and reliable, high quality results. And once I did that enough, they were willing to say, okay, no one's perfect. Yes, Ethan had this problem, but that's not his usual result. Because again, if you have 10 interviews, they're great. And then you have one interview where, whatever, it was your birthday the day before and you're hungover and you do a terrible interview. People don't conclude you're a terrible interviewer. They instead conclude, well, Felix had a really bad day, right? And that's
Right.
that's how you rebuild trust. Consistency over time.
Thanks for sharing that. It really resonates a lot, especially the consistency piece. It is just no one single formula. I think it's the word consistency. Now you talk about owning something, owning up your mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
owning sort of like your career. There's a lot of these words, ownership, and I know that one of your biggest contribution is shaping one of the core leadership principles at Amazon, which is ownership.
Yes.
How do you identify ownership? How do you hire for people who would have strong ownership into a company?
So it's a great question. Interviewing in general is very hard and imprecise. But
Yeah.
what you look for and you ask people about is first situations where they were the responsible person. For example, even if someone only had a small startup, we often liked in the leadership positions to hire people who had been CEO of their own startup, whether it succeeded or failed, because CEOs have nowhere to hide. They must be the owner. They're the last decision maker. They're the person either paying the paychecks or raising the money to pay the paychecks. And so they can't hide. Obviously, not everyone you can hire can you say, well, have you been a CEO first? But you're looking for where did they have primary responsibility? Where did they sort of have inescapable responsibility? The second thing you're looking for is places or stories you interview and ask, when was a case where everything came down to you? Or when can you tell me about a time where a project or a critical customer delivery or whatever depended only on you? And so a simple story that might be a lot easier that people are familiar with is on-call rotations. So most people in technology are familiar. Well, when the pager goes off at 3 a.m., that problem begins with you. And there's pressure for you to solve it as opposed to waking a bunch of other people up. That's why you're on call and they're not. The basic idea is you'll handle it so they can sleep. That's an ownership situation. So you ask people, and if people tell you, oh, I hate on call, like I don't like it, I feel like I'm a victim where I'm solving someone else's problem. That's actually true, by the way. Like someone else wrote the bug and their stuff broke, but it's a matter of how you look at it. And so owners owners don't ask whose fault is this. They ask, am I the right person to fix it? Can I? And they're looking for, how do I fix this, not who can I blame. And so when you ask people about, tell me about a time you were a part of a project that didn't go well, and all you hear is how other people effed it up, they're probably not an owner, right?
Wow.
It, it, yeah.
So a lot of it is, as you say, is really kind of looking inward and not saying, hey, someone F it up, or this is someone else's job, but to say, am I the right person to solve it? Can I solve it? Not should I? Because just, there's just so many people, especially when I was in school, there's just a lot of people who are like, hey, this was not in my job description, or maybe this was not what we were assigned to, so I'm not gonna do that. Sort of Singapore's education somehow promotes that, by the way, unconsciously, I think. But there's a
Absolutely.
lot of sort of lack of ownership whenever you say, this is not my job, this is not what I was assigned to, go to that person. And I think that's where the
Well,
chain kind of breaks.
that's in fact the exact story of how I got involved in writing the ownership leadership principle at Amazon. Is long before I got to Amazon, I had asked someone to do something at a startup, like mid-sized company by that point, it had grown, I was at. And he didn't address my request at all by saying, it's a good idea, it's a bad idea, I agree with it, I don't. He simply said, that's not in my job description. Would you like to see it?
Whoa.
And that was such a bureaucratic answer. It horrified me. And later, when I got to Amazon and I had the opportunity to contribute to the words in the Amazon leadership principle, which are on their website, you can still see it. The words that are mine, I helped draft a rough draft of the whole thing, but the words that are specifically are mine are, an owner never says that's not my job. Because that's just a weak excuse. An owner can say, that's a dumb idea, and let me give you 5 reasons I don't think we should do it. An owner can also say, that's a good idea, I'm not the right person. What I'll own is finding them. That's ownership. And then the last thing I can say is, yeah, okay, I'll do that, or I can do that. You don't always have to do the work. You don't always even have to feel the work should be done, but your reasoning should be based on something other than, that's not my job.
Wow.
And
That is a horrific incident. I would never expect someone to say that.
Oh yeah, that's it. That quote is, it's burned into my brain. And it was over 10 years later that I then wrote it into the Amazon leadership principle. And that was over 10 years ago. And it's just like the whole thing is burned into my brain because I was so horrified. And this person wasn't like a stranger to me. They were a coworker that I knew, that I'd had lunch with and dinner with. And I was so shocked because the answer was so low ownership. And also, I've talked about people help those who help them. He didn't do that, right? He was like,
Right.
not my problem. I just,
Wow.
I also remember once early in my career, I was trying to get something done, and this will seem like a bureaucrat to you. I was talking to a maintenance man in my university, and a person very low on the totem pole in a very big structured organization, maybe somewhat like, say, the Singapore government that you referenced. And he actually said, I ain't making no damn decision. Now, part of that's terrible English, which made it stick with me. But he was very clearly telling someone else who was there is no way I'm taking responsibility for this. And I looked at it, I'm like, it's a small thing. Like, I'm a student and I'll make the decision, but he had just been so trained that making a wrong decision leads to punishment that he was willing to take no risk at all. I ain't making no damn decision. And so that's the complete opposite. And those things stuck with me of, I will never be like that.
Wow. This story feels like, I think it feels so real to everyone just listening to that. It feels horrific as well, by the way. So thanks for sharing that. And I know that, we were on the topic of interviews, and we're probably going to close this wrap this thing up soon. But you have interviewed 2,500 people.
Yes.
There are tons of rejections, I'm sure, because one job description, I mean, one job posting only has one candidate at any point of time that you hire.
Yes.
What advice would you have for people trying to stand out in interviews out of thousands and thousands of applicants?
Yeah. So I'm going to give two pieces of advice.
Yeah.
One of them is people people try to write their resume to appeal to every possible position because they're afraid of missing out. But that isn't how our world works. Our world works on it's much more important to be the first or second candidate for a few roles than to come in seventh for dozens of roles because the seventh candidate doesn't get called. So it's better to specialize your resume and say, I'm actually really good at this one thing than it is to say I'm good at all this stuff. So if I, for example, said, "Oh yeah, I'm an executive coach. I coach executives," you might not have invited me here. But you honed in on I've made an expertise of helping people get unstuck. That's very specific and interesting. The same thing applies to candidates. What are you really good at? Many people will look and say, "Well, we don't need that." Right? Maybe you're a great designer for, I'll be absurd on purpose. Well, somewhat absurd. Maybe you're a great designer for Apple Watch apps, not apps in general and not Google. You're the Apple Watch person. Well, many people who need a designer will say, like, I'm not doing Apple Watch. I don't need you. But when someone does need a designer to do an Apple Watch app, you're going to be immediately first because no one else has specialized that way. And they're going to be like, wow, Felix is the Apple Watch person. And he's done 7 Apple Watch apps. We need him. That's thing one. Thing two is results. Most people on their resume tell what they've done. They write down, I worked at whatever, Acme Inc., and I led 6 people and I managed them and I held the meetings and I wrote the schedule. Writing down what you do makes you a doer. What you need to do is write down what did your team accomplish and what was the business impact. I built this app and this app raised our customer engagement 20%, leading to $7 million of additional profit. That makes you valuable. Because what am I thinking? In the first case, I'm thinking, well, I need this work done. I can hire Felix to do it. That's great. And the second one, I'm thinking, wow, Felix makes his companies money. He solves problems. He gets things finished. And those things are what you may have heard, I'm not hiring a person. When I put up a job description, I'm trying to solve a problem. And so you want to show me that you solve problems, not that you do work. Doing work will get you a job, but it will get you a low-level job as a worker. If you want to be a leader, you better show you've led. And leaders generate high-impact results, so you have to show those results.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Ethan. So to summarize up, there's 2 things. One is, be niche and be known for that one thing, and when the opportunity comes, it's right there for you. And the second, as you said, be the top 2. And the second thing is to show results, not just show what you have done. These 2 really stood out. So we'll continue to advocate for that. And on the last question on interview, and then we'll sort of move on to the final sort of contrary part of things to wrap things up. I read somewhere that you famously had, you yourself had an opportunity to interview at SpaceX, and you had a really honest interview with Elon Musk for the role of vice president as well at SpaceX. What were some of the key takeaways and lessons that you took away from that interview with the world's richest man right now?
So he wasn't quite the richest man, although he was certainly very rich when I interviewed with him. But about 10 years ago, I got a call to go interview at SpaceX as VP of software. And the critical part of the story is I wrote the recruiter back and I said, what kind of VP of software do you want? Type 1 focuses on leading the team to accomplish the goals. And type 2, I view as more of a CTO. They're like super technical and they code part-time. And they're like very much an active developer. And I said, I'm type 1. Is that what you want? because I don't do type 2. I've stepped away from coding because I believe the time I spend coding, I should spend leading more. Now, the recruiter said, "Oh yeah, that's absolutely what we want." So fast forward, I go there, I'm having my day, I talk to a couple people, I get into Elon's office, we're having a nice talk. Um, he seems like a really interesting guy, not surprisingly. And he says, just one thing, I would expect you to code at least 10% of your time. And, after I sort of picked my jaw back up off the table, like, I said to him, do you have any idea that I talked to your recruiters about that? And they said that's not at all what you want. And he said, that's crazy. That's exactly what I want. So I'm like, okay, we have a rocket reference, right? Houston, we have a problem. So the next thing I said to him is, I said, well, I don't agree with that. I was transparent with him. I said, I told him I don't do that. And I really don't agree with it here because it seems insane to me to have a part-time dilettante coder writing code on something that people are going to ride into space. Like, that seems like a good way to later find out I blew up 3 or 4 people. Aren't you worried about that? And he said, well, you have a point. Maybe you should write like diagnostic code or but I want you to code. I don't believe that people who aren't coding can lead engineering. And basically I said, well, I was honest with your team. I don't do that. And he was kind. He was nicer than you might expect from his sort of public persona. He said, well, we're going to have to disagree. And kind of, I own the company, so that means you're not a fit. He didn't say all those words. He just sort of left it hanging. I said, so I get it. I don't want to waste your time then. I'm not the right person. So let's call it off. So I had like a 30-minute interview scheduled with him, and I was out of his office in under 15 minutes. And he had an open office, like a cube. And as I was leaving, I heard him say, get so-and-so on the phone. And that was his VP of recruiting. So basically, that guy was very frosty to me. I sent him a like, thank you for the invitation note. Sorry it didn't work out. And he's like, yeah, it was sure a waste of time, or like kind of like a dick. But I think he got chewed on pretty hard because, I don't think Musk brooks fools very gladly from his public persona. And I think he told that guy, like, you just wasted both of our time. And I was humiliated as CEO when this guy's telling me like my recruiting team told him something completely different. So I suspect that was a awkward phone call.
Wow. Thanks for that, Ethan. It seems like, what we can really take away from there is like, if something doesn't fit what you're looking for as well, you should be honest about it during the interview and be ready to disagree or be ready to share the feedback as well. Because just so many times we see people accept jobs that might not be what they want or where their career is going, and they just take it.
This is important.
That is a big lesson.
If I can add to the story, I had a moment where I absolutely thought I can lie to him. It went through my head. He's asking me to code, but he's not going to test my coding, and nobody else is going to. So I can tell him, yeah, absolutely, totally agree, and then come here and not do it, or come here and try to do it a little bit. But I don't lie. So I didn't want to do that. And second, I knew that I would be unhappy because eventually he's going to figure out that I'm not who I said I was. So basically, I had this idea I could lie and get this job. And I did really want to work at SpaceX. I was going to report directly to this famous guy and, to be part of putting people in space and maybe on Mars. Wonderful, fascinating, powerful job. Historic job. So I wanted it. But you do have to have the confidence to be true to what you do best. And this job was not a fit for me. So even though it was super appealing from a impact in the history books kind of sense, it wasn't a fit for me. And I needed to be, willing to walk away. And so I think the takeaway lesson is be willing to stay true to what you do well. And that wasn't a fit for me. So I have no regrets over walking away. Right.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Well, I mean, if you would have liked there, you would have maybe blew up 1 or 2 person and sent someone up to the
right.
moon.
I mean,
perhaps
I'm not.
that would have. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Ethan. And down to the last question, and then we're wrapping up this interview today. Thanks so much for your time, by the way. Is that you have famously shared some very controversial and contrarian thoughts around, I think one, the handshake policy, and second, advocating for not going back to the office. Can
Yep.
you talk a little bit about these two contrarian thoughts, and why you say what you say about that?
Sure. Well, the first thing is I recognize there's lots of people who have contrarian thoughts, but because they work in corporations, they're afraid to share them. So I see part
Yeah.
of my job, part of my value to people who read what I write and who come to my classes is I can tell the honest truth because people don't have to like the truth, but no one can fire me from my job. They either the worst they can do is say, well, I'm not going to like you or subscribe to you, which is
Yeah.
fine. So
Yeah.
the first view is handshake policy. What that means specifically is I've done a lot of critical deals in my life by talking to the other person, coming to agreement, and not needing a lawyer or a contract or running around to put something on paper. Trust, and this is sort of, a lot of people say this is a terrible idea. A lot of people would say, well, that person's going to screw you, or what if they walk away? Um, and the last part is just, well, this is common practice. Like, you're violating common practice. The thing I would say is, number one, I realize I'm lucky. I work with high quality people, right? I'm normally working with executives who it's not in their best interest to cheat or lie or steal or break a deal. But second, showing people trust. You ask about building trust. If I show people trust, they generally will show me trust in return. So I will give some very specific examples um, where I've used this policy. Uh, if people go to my website, www.ethanevans.com, it's all built by a web designer, someone who could be in your community for all I know, who came to me and said, hey, your website doesn't look that good. Would you trade some coaching time and I'll rebuild it? Well, he's rebuilt it. I've spent 1 hour so far coaching him. On the ratio of his work to my work that we agreed with, I owe him a bunch of hours. I have the website. I could just easily change the password and never follow through. So he's in the exposed position at this point, but I'm also exposed in that I gave him the passwords and everything to my website. And, obviously he could be like, oh, this is a funny joke. This dummy gave me his passwords. I'm going to put up pornography. But
Yeah.
there's just no reason to make, a deal there, write a bunch of stuff down and require a contract. Here's a good guy who came to me trying to help me. I can afford the risk to help him back. That's one example. A bigger example, I have a partner in my newsletter, Jason Young, and Jason came to me the same way. He said, I'd like to build a newsletter for you. I think your content should have a newsletter. I'll build it if you'll let me use your content. And that's I didn't know him. We'd never met. But I said, okay, let's try this. You set it up, you pick the platform, you start doing the work, I'll supply my content. Now, over the fullness of time, because he's done such a good job, we agreed on a financial arrangement, and we did decide, because money can be so critical, to write it down. But everything, he was already working for me on a handshake, putting in hundreds of his hours on the trust that I would follow through. And those are just two examples of handshake deals. So I don't know if you have questions about that. I'm also happy to talk about return to office.
No, I don't have questions on that. I just find it really fascinating. And fun fact, this is exactly how ADP List, we're a global mentorship platform. This is exactly how we started when my co-founder reached out and say, hey, I saw you're working on this. Can I just help you with it? and he just started putting credit card on some of the bills, his personal credit card. We have not even met in person up to today. We've been about 3 years now into this company, and so somehow it's just this handshake policy, and I 100% agree with you on that. Obviously there are risk on that, but for most part of it, it seems to have worked out. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you'll get burnt.
So
I mean, eventually you will get burnt by somebody, but you have to ask, is that one time you get burnt worth all the distrust and stress and lawyers and legal bills?
yeah,
I had another company I was trying to work with, and they sent me this contract, and they're good people, but they're in the default mind that everything has to have a contract. And I spent $6,000 on my side of the legal editing of the contract,
wow,
and they probably spent the same, and it just wasn't worth it, and it antagonized me in the process, where eventually I had to write them and be like, do you understand I'm a volunteer? Like, I'm doing this work without any pay. I'm volunteering to help you, and you're dragging me through this huge contract.
God,
Like,
wow,
what the f? So good people, but just with the wrong idea in that case. So
wow,
the other thing you've asked about is return to office.
yep,
And I've advocated for the fact that we don't need to return to offices much. Offices do have advantages, but they have a lot of costs. And my main advocacy is based on this idea. I'll just ask you a trivia question. Would you like to take a guess? When was the first dedicated office building built? So, like, when did someone say, we need this thing for people to get together and work together in a space, and we're going to build a special building that's not a factory and not a warehouse and not a home. It's going to be for nothing but people to go together and do their jobs in like with paperwork, not with like a factory. When would that have happened?
wow. Maybe 200 years, 100, 200 years.
So the answer is even longer. It's 1726 in London.
Right.
And so the point of this is we've been building offices and kind of figuring out how to work in offices for 300 years. Now, if you compare that to remote work, you can argue remote work started some in like the 2000s with people being remote and working by phone or email or whatever. But really serious remote work started with the pandemic. And so whether you say it's 20 years old or you say it's only 5 years old, you have to ask yourself, people say like, oh, but collaboration isn't as good in the office or at home, or this isn't as good or that isn't as good. And that's the reason why we have to go back to the office. What I say is you're comparing something that's been maturing for 300 years and isn't going to get any better with something that's brand new and complaining. And so the analogy I use is like, you can look at cell phones. You said you're 37. That means you're old enough that the first cell phone you saw was, not an iPhone. It was like one of the car phones that comes in a bag almost. And,
Yeah.
or at best, a Motorola flip phone. And now you have your iPhone 15 or whatever you use. Remote work is going to go through that same growing curve. And the iPhone 15 is great, but it's slow. The innovation on iPhones is or Google phones is now somewhat slowing down. Like, they're not as much better as they were on a relative step basis. Eventually that will happen for remote work, but we're still very early in the learning. So the main reason I hold the contrarian view is people who are shouting back to office are going back to what's 300 years old, and they're adopting the past. The companies that are figuring out remote work are adopting the future. And I just think if you're fighting to go back to the past because it's tried and true and safe and trusted, you have the wrong overall mentality. And that will eventually cost you. Today it may be better, right? A little bit better, but it's like insisting on using your BlackBerry. It just isn't. It's the wrong direction.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Ethan. Those two thoughts, especially the work from home one, is quite a thought, and I think from a crypto bro perspective, they're just gonna say that if you don't adopt this mindset, you're not gonna make it. That is what the slang would be these days.
Yeah, I agree, and
Um,
I'm not trying. There are real advantages to the office. I don't know, for example, have you and your co-founder ever gotten together physically? Because I think
No,
you're
no, we have not.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So I consider this gentleman, Jason, to be somewhat my co founder. And we just made plans to get together to like spend a week together. Exactly because we believe there is some value in the chance to sit together in a space and like share a meal and work together over the same piece of paper. But it's not really that the work will be more effective, it's that it's an investment in relationship building that will then make all of our virtual work more effective. And yeah, I would challenge you to think because you're in Singapore and I think your co-founder's in India, right?
He's in Ghana, Africa.
Ghana,
Yeah,
Africa. Okay, very difficult. But you would still ask, maybe we should, maybe we should both have a holiday in Dubai once, right?
yeah.
Like, yeah, or whatever. What would we get out of that? So it's not that I'm against the idea of people being together. I'm against the idea that there's so much magic that we have to force people to commute every day. That
Wow.
offices are an unnatural environment that were created before phones and computers and VR and Zoom. Why are we so stuck on that? We're stuck on it because it's how it always has been, and that's a terrible reason.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Ethan. Now we have come to the end of today's interview, Ethan. I really appreciate your time extending as well. Before we, wrap this up, are there any final thoughts you want to share, and where can people find you as well? What resources, you know, uh, would you want to share with them?
Sure. Um, so the easiest place to find me is LinkedIn. I'm Ethan Evans VP on LinkedIn. And of course, my own website, which is ethanevans.com. Um, what I do is I help people have high performance, satisfying careers. So not only how do you grow in your career, but also how do you find a career that you really love, that you enjoy, and how do you get to that spot? That's what I do. If that's what you'd like, I encourage you to follow me. I have a newsletter on Substack called Level Up with Ethan Evans. Those are three great places to find me. And
Yep.
thank you for asking.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ethan. We'll be including those in our recordings. Plus, Utkash, our team member, has already sent it to the comment section for everyone to check it out. So, Ethan, thank you so much for doing this. As I said, I would really love for you to also contribute a guest post to ADP List. Tons of folks who would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time, Ethan. Really appreciate this interview.
Yeah, it's very much been my pleasure, Felix. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.